Winter in the Middle Ages wasn't just cold, it was medieval cold. Think less cozy castle with a roaring fire. You live in nature's walk-in freezer, while fairy tales paint a romantic picture of wintertime nobility sipping mead by the hearth. The reality for most medieval peasants was much grimmer. Imagine waking before sunrise in a house so cold it felt like the walls were made of ice, and probably were. If your breath didn't freeze in midair, your eyebrows might. One chronicler even described waking up with actual frost on his face. That's not ambiance, that's a cry for help. And we complain when the thermostat dips below 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, in 14th century England or northern France, winter temperatures could drop to 0. That's Fahrenheit, not some Celsius trickery. Cold enough to freeze your boots to the floor, literally. Historical accounts mention this happening more often than you'd like to believe. The daily routine didn't wait for the sun. Peasants dragged themselves from their makeshift beds, often nothing more than thick piles of hay and straw, to feed animals, haul firewood, or break ice just to reach water. Think of it as a full-body ice bath every morning, and those hay beds, surprisingly effective. Archaeological digs have shown they could be up to 2 feet thick, an insulating marvel of medieval ingenuity. These were not just scratchy piles of grass. They were carefully layered, refreshed, and fluffed with summer-stored hay. Basically the peasant version of a memory foam mattress, if memory foam smelled like livestock. So next time you wrap yourself in a heated blanket, spare a thought for the frostbitten folks who lived through winters with little more than hay, grit, and sheer determination. If you thought your cold bedroom floor was bad, try sleeping on a dirt floor that turned into a tundra every winter. That's why medieval peasants didn't just toss hay on the ground for fun. It was a survival tactic. They piled it thick to keep their bodies off the icy earth, essentially building DIY insulation from the ground up. Every morning meant shaking out the bedding, and not just to fluff it. Hay beds had a habit of attracting surprises, mice nesting in the warmth, bugs treating it like a buffet, and in one wonderfully odd historical account, a chicken laying an egg in a man's bed. Now that's breakfast in bed. Despite the occasional pest problem, hay beds had a secret superpower: insulation. When packed tightly, the hay trapped air pockets that held in warmth, kind of like nature's version of bubble wrap. Peasants layered in whatever else they could find. Old rags, moth-eaten blankets, even dried moss, anything to keep out the chill. But hay has its flaws. It soaks up moisture like a sponge, and in the damp medieval climate, that meant musty, sneeze-inducing nights. There's even a tale of a nobleman who had to crash in a peasant's home and complained for weeks that the haybed made him sneeze so violently he feared his nose might fall off. Antihistamines? Not an option. Still, these hay piles pulled double duty. By day, they transformed into seating. Guests, if any braved the elements to visit, would plop down on them like scratchy, uneven beanbags. Call it peasant chic. Oddly enough, haybeds had one advantage over some modern mattresses. Bed bugs hated them. Turns out bugs prefer fabric, but if there was one real MVP of winter survival, it was wool. The medieval peasant's superhero suit, except instead of leaping tall buildings, it fought off frostbite. Wool was everywhere. Tunics, cloaks, socks, even makeshift mittens. Some families owned up to 20 pounds of wool clothing, roughly the weight of a small child, but this one kept you warm and occasionally made you itch like mad. Getting that wool wasn't easy. Each spring, shepherds would shear their sheep and peasants would trade or buy raw wool. Then came the real work: cleaning, carding, spinning. You didn't just wear wool, you earned it. Medieval wool wasn't just clothing, it was cold weather armor. Thanks to lanolin, the natural oil in sheep's fleece, wool garments repelled water like a charm. Sure, they reeked like wet livestock when it rained, but that was the price of staying dry. Some savvy peasants even left the lanolin untouched on purpose. They may have smelled like a damp herd, but they stayed warmer and probably weren't too concerned about winning any fashion awards or dining with nobility. One thing they definitely didn't do often: wash their wool. And for once, that was actually smart. In freezing weather, wet wool meant real trouble. One winter tale tells of a peasant who washed his wool coat only to find it frozen so stiff it stood up on its own. It became a village punchline, stiffer than John's winter washing. Of course, wool came with its own issues. Fleas loved it a lot. To fight back, peasants would hang their wool clothes near the hearth so the smoke would drive the little pests away. It worked, sort of, but it left everyone smelling like they'd rolled through a bonfire in a barn. Medieval peasant perfume at its finest. Still, wool's magic showed itself when winter was at its worst. Even soaked, it kept people warm, retaining up to 80% of its insulating power, as modern science later confirmed. But medieval folk didn't need a lab to tell them that. They learned the hard way, trudging through snowstorms wrapped in layer after layer, looking like mobile hay bales trying to outlast a blizzard. And one layer? That was laughable. The real pros dressed until their arms barely moved. Layering wasn't a trend, it was survival. Underneath it all was usually a long linen shirt, then a wool tunic, followed by another tunic, because why not? Add a sleeveless wool jerkin, maybe a cloak lined with fur if they were lucky, and hold it all together with a rope belt, which had one job, keeping the pile from sliding off. Getting dressed in winter was practically an exercise routine. One story tells of a man who got so entangled in his layers that his wife had to roll him around on the floor like a log until he wriggled free. And we think zippers are annoying. Still, the layering worked. Thin layers created pockets of warm air, better at trapping heat than a single thick one. Peasants figured that out the hard way, through trial, error, and a lot of frozen toes. The real challenge came when nature called. Getting out of all those clothes for a quick trip to the outhouse was anything but quick. Some folks avoided drinking water just to skip the freezing strip down. Priorities, right? Kids had it even worse. Parents bundled them so tightly they waddled through villages like clumsy penguins. One medieval observer joked that you could always tell the children in winter. They were the little wool-wrapped bundles rolling down the hills because they couldn't bend their knees to walk. But even wool and hay couldn't do the job alone. There was one final critical ingredient to surviving the long medieval winter: the fire. The hearth was the heart of every home, the only thing standing between you and the frost. And it was as much a hazard as it was a blessing. A fireplace, if you could even call it that, was the medieval answer to central heating. Picture a shallow pit in the middle of the room, fire smoldering lazily, smoke curling wherever it pleased, and you've got the vibe. Chimneys weren't standard issue yet, so homes were filled with the perpetual fog that gave everyone a nice, slow-smoked finish. Think less cozy hearth and more human jerky factory. Archaeological digs have shown that these fire pits were usually about 3 feet wide, ringed with stones. But despite all that effort, only a fraction of the heat actually stuck around. Most of it went soaring out through crude roof holes, which were supposed to vent the smoke but often just welcomed snowflakes and birds instead. Medieval heating was less efficient system and more open invitation to frostbite. And then there was the fuel situation. Dry firewood? That was a luxury item. Peasants burned whatever they could scrounge. Old tools, splintered carts, broken stools, into the fire they went. An abandoned barn became fair game, board by board, especially during long winters. One English village even made local history for slowly dismantling a barn for firewood. The lord was, predictably, not thrilled. Starting the fire each morning was its own winter ritual. Peasants buried a single coal in ashes overnight, hoping it would survive until dawn. If it died, someone got to enjoy a freezing jog to a neighbor's house to borrow some flame. One story tells of a man who raced home with a glowing coal tucked into a hollowed-out turnip. He ran so fast to keep it alive that villagers thought he was fleeing a demon. Smoke, while a health hazard by modern standards, had its perks. It chased off insects, cured meats, and even preserved wooden roof beams. Many medieval house timbers survived thanks to a thick protective coat of soot. Not exactly something you'll find in today's HGTV renovation shows, but hey, it worked. Fire management was practically a family skill. Some slept in shifts just to keep it going through the night. Others had carefully developed methods of banking coals, sometimes even whispering to the fire for luck, though that might have just been the result of too much smoke inhalation. After a long day of trying not to freeze or suffocate, it was time for dinner. If you're picturing a medieval feast, slow down. Winter meals were usually a game of what's in the pot. The pot itself sat above the fire all day, collecting whatever scraps could be spared. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and the ever-mysterious neeps, which sound more like medieval goblins than food, were the usual stars. Creativity filled the gaps. Tree bark added fiber. Pebbles were, in theory, a mineral boost. Leather, protein. One record tells of a family so desperate they tried to stew their wooden spoon. They claimed it added flavor. Desperation breeds culinary innovation, apparently. But don't count them out. Peasants were masters of food storage. Vegetables were packed in sand, meats were salted or smoked to last through the cold, and herbs were hung in bundles from the rafters like the ceiling doubled as a potion shop. These herbs weren't just for flavor either. Many had medicinal value to fight winter sniffles, or whatever mysterious illnesses came from sleeping in hay, eating bark stew, and breathing smoke all day. One of the more inventive winter flavor enhancers was poor man's pepper, a wild herb that could spice up even the blandest dish, or at least mask the flavor of week-old meat. With enough of it, even boiled shoe leather became dinner. And as everyone gathered around the fire pit and stew pot each night, passing around gossip and maybe something that used to be a carrot, they weren't exactly alone. Not by a long shot, because when winter hit, the animals moved in. Historical research shows that medieval peasants often shared up to a third of their living space with livestock during the coldest months. Chickens roosted by the walls, pigs snuffled around near the hearth, and cows slumbered in the corner like oversized hay-scented roommates. It wasn't glamorous, but it was warm. And in a season where every degree mattered, a cow in the living room was less of an inconvenience and more of a medieval space heater with hooves. Forget your modern insulated front doors with stylish knockers and fancy handles. A medieval peasant's door was often just a slab of wood, if they were lucky. If they weren't, it might be woven reeds, stitched together animal hides, or whatever spare planks they could wrestle from a collapsing shed. Hinges, optional, latches, maybe, windproof, not a chance. To combat drafts, many peasants hung heavy wool or fur cloths over the doorway, creating a kind of medieval airlock. Guests would enter by pushing aside this thick curtain, often brushing past a crusty patchwork of old cloaks and retired tunics repurposed into a kind of fashion-forward weatherproofing. One chronicler joked that entering a peasant's home was like climbing through a coat rack in a barn. Windows, if they existed at all, were small glassless slits covered with oiled parchment or thin animal bladder. These let in light but kept out some of the wind and most of the birds. During winter, many peasants simply blocked them off entirely with wood or cloth, preferring to stumble around inside like mole people rather than let Jack Frost sneak in through the windowsill. Roofs, too, were a masterpiece of improvisation. Thatched roofs were common, made from layers of straw or reeds. They were excellent at shedding rain and snow, and even better at harboring rodents. Mice and birds frequently took up residence in the rafters, sometimes dropping in, literally, during meals or nighttime. One unlucky family reported having a rat fall straight into their stew pot, which, after some debate, they still ate. Waste not, want not. Still, the thatched roof had one big bonus: insulation. Thick thatch could trap heat surprisingly well. Add in all the smoke drifting up from the ever-burning fire pit, and the roof beams turned into a cozy, if highly flammable, heat trap. Of course, this meant that house fires were an ever-present threat. One spark too many, and it was less home sweet home and more bonfire with walls. And yet, despite all these architectural quirks, peasant homes worked. They were cramped, smoky, often damp, and occasionally mooed at you. But they kept people alive through some of the harshest winters in recorded history. Because when the snow piled high and the wind howled through the trees, medieval peasants didn't need comfort. They needed cleverness, community, and just enough warmth to wake up with their fingers still working. In the heart of the medieval countryside, even the humblest peasant home bore the imprint of practical genius. Most cottages featured a single door, strategically positioned away from the prevailing wind, not by chance, but as a deliberate defense against the elements. Some builders even fashioned small entry tunnels, reminiscent of the windbreak structures found in Arctic igloos. One chronicler of the age poetically likened such an entrance to the throat of a dragon. Perhaps an apt metaphor, considering the pungent aromas wafting from animals housed indoors. Roofs were marvels of layered construction. Brushwood, straw, interwoven branches, and sometimes sod cut from nearby meadows. In certain regions, these earthen rooftops were allowed to sprout grass, not for aesthetics or early environmentalism, but because the living roots helped bind the materials in place. As a bonus, goats occasionally scaled the rooftops, turning cottages into miniature pastures. But building a stout house was only part of a peasant's battle against the ruthless medieval winter. Survival also demanded an array of seasonal tools, crafted, cherished, and passed down through generations. Excavations reveal that the typical peasant household maintained between 6 to 8 winter implements, each one a quiet testament to centuries of adaptation and resilience. Chief among these was the snow shovel. Not the flimsy plastic kind we know today, but a formidable slab of hardwood, hewn from a single piece of timber. Its wide, flat blade was astonishingly efficient. Modern tests of replica tools show they could move 30% more snow per scoop than their modern counterparts, though hefting one was no small task. It was medieval fitness training at its finest. Then there were the winter garments, especially socks, which were so prized that a well-made pair might fetch the same price as a chicken in local markets. These weren't just thick woolens. Peasants ingeniously wove rabbit fur between layers of wool, creating footwear that was both warm and durable, a humble but brilliant form of early insulation. In every detail, from the doorways to the tools, from rooftops to rabbit-lined socks, medieval life was a masterclass in survival, ingenuity, and adaptation, proof that even in the harshest of times, humanity finds ways not only to endure, but to innovate. Among the many weapons in a medieval peasant's winter arsenal, none were more cherished than their socks and boots. One exasperated writer of the time even grumbled that his feet grew so warm in these fur-lined socks, he feared they might start cooking. These weren't simple garments. They were wearable furnaces, crafted with care and designed for endurance. Yet perhaps the most intriguing tool of all was the snow scorer, a long, sturdy stick used to mark paths through the snowdrifts. Before the onset of blizzards, peasants would plant these markers along frequently traveled routes, ensuring safe passage even when the landscape turned into a blinding white void. In one particularly inventive village, the snow scorers were painted with berry juice in different colors, creating what can only be described as an early analog version of a GPS system. Getting lost in a medieval snowstorm wasn't just inconvenient, it was often fatal. Then came the mitten, the unsung hero of the cold season. Not gloves, but mittens. Because even without thermometers or thermal imaging, medieval folk understood something that modern science later confirmed. Keeping fingers together preserves heat more effectively than separating them. These mittens weren't factory-made. They were crafted at home, often padded with whatever could be found: dried moss, chicken feathers, even in one especially creative case, cat hair. Nothing went to waste in a world where survival was a daily challenge. Readiness was essential because weather in the Middle Ages was notoriously unpredictable. Forecasting relied more on observation than instruments. A sudden chill in the air, the behavior of animals, these were their meteorologists. If the cows huddled unusually close, or pigs began gathering straw with enthusiasm, it was time to brace for a change. Crude though it sounds, these methods were often remarkably effective. These small, ingenious adaptations, rooted in observation, necessity, and a deep intimacy with the land, reveal a world where every winter was a test and every day a lesson. From fur-stuffed mittens to snow-marking sticks, from animal instincts to woolen wonders, medieval peasants didn't just survive the cold, they engineered their lives around it. Their quiet innovations stand as a testament to human tenacity and creativity in an age where the line between comfort and catastrophe could be as thin as a rabbit fur sock.